Latinx Talk. Folks, people out there watching right now, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Allyson P. Brantley, who is an assistant professor of history and director of honors and interdisciplinary initiatives at the University of La Verne in Southern California. Professor Brantley, welcome to Latinx Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Felipe. It's really great to be here.
Fantastic. Good to have you. Professor Brantley is also a recipient of a 2020-2021 Mellon Emerging Faculty Leaders Fellowship from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. Professor Brantley writes and teaches about consumer society and politics, Latinx and labor histories, the United States-Mexico borderlands, and the history of beer and brewing in the United States. She lives in Los Angeles and enjoys exploring the city, visiting museums, and hiking in its surrounding parks and forests. We are here today to talk about this fantastic book right here, Brewing, a Boycott, How a Grassroots Coalition Fought Coors and Remade American Consumer Activism, published by the University of North Carolina Press just this year. Is that right, 2021?
Yeah, just a couple months ago.
It just dropped. Okay, fantastic. Well, it's great to have you on here. For those of you out there watching us now, this is a part of our Latinx Talk programming that we do when we talk to authors about their books. And so we'll spend a little bit of time with Professor Brantley this afternoon talking about Brewing, a Boycott. So let me just jump in. Let me dive in here, Professor Brantley. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing. Where did you grow up, and how did you get into, or how did you first become interested in studying history as an academic field?
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up in Colorado in Boulder, but my whole family is from the Midwest, from Iowa. So growing up, I was always really interested in the history of the Midwest and our family and our connections to some farmland there. But I always thought that I would go into something different than history. I think, if there are students watching, the feeling of like history is cool, but it's not really a career to pursue. And when I was in college, I went to the University of Notre Dame. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, especially after I graduated. And I ended up graduating and spending a year in El Paso, Texas, doing an AmeriCorps service program. It was with an organization called the Border Servant Corps. And I worked with middle school students in the borderlands in El Paso, who a lot of them lived in Ciudad Juarez and would come over every day. This was in 2009, 2010. So it was a period of significant violence in the border. And I was really drawn to the region, which was sort of strange because I always thought I would be sort of a Midwestern person. But I was drawn to the region, and I was drawn to its history. And I found myself being really fascinated, not only in the policy issues that faced people in the borderlands and more broadly immigration policy, but also the history challenges. And so I ended up deciding to get a PhD in history. When I went to Yale, I thought that I wanted to study borderlands history. And I mean, I sort of did, but I was really interested in consumer culture in the borderlands. I thought that I would write a dissertation about progressive era consumer culture. And within the first year, I ended up stumbling on the story of the Coors boycott. And I thought it was interesting, but it was way outside of my range of understanding. It was outside of my fields, but I ended up obviously pursuing it and writing a book about it. And so I got kind of distracted along the way. I mean, looking back, it feels like a direct line from just a tentative interest in history to this book, but it was sort of a long and convoluted path. And I made it there because of the communities in the borderlands.
So in the borderlands, when you're there with AmeriCorps, is this when you become sort of conscious of Chicano history as a field and the study of that? And where did that sort of dictate where you wanted to go study and go to graduate school?
So I was aware of Chicano history because of my undergraduate career. I mean, one thing to say about growing up in Colorado, obviously it's a state that was once in Mexico. It's a borderlands state. It's sort of a broad way of thinking about the borderlands, but we never learned anything about Mexican American or Chicano history in my public school. I mean, I went to high school in Boulder, which is a progressive place, but it's very much a segregated town. It's very much sort of segregated by class and by race. And when I was in undergrad at Notre Dame, because of the Institute for Latino Studies there, I was able to learn more about Chicano and Latino history. And I did more so once I realized I was interested in the borderlands. But yeah, then once I realized my interest in the borderlands and a desire to learn more about this history, I was attracted to Yale and to the program there, and in particular working with my dissertation advisor, Steve Pitti.
So there's a lot that you write about in the book in terms of the boycott and the Coors boycott. And you and I were talking before the program about the Coors boycott and its relevance and its importance and significance to Chicano history. Tell us about this boycott. What was it about? Why is it so important to Chicano and labor history and histories of consumer activism?
Yeah, so, well, as you brought up before, the Coors boycott comes up in Chicano history textbooks, usually as a paragraph or two, kind of located in the late 1960s in Colorado, and the name associated with it is always Corky Gonzalez. But what I found when I started digging—
leader of the Crusade for Justice in Denver.
Yeah. So the kind of the most famous figure of Chicano politics to come out of Colorado. What I found once I started digging to understand more about what happened is that the Chicano boycott is one piece of a much broader movement against Coors. So kind of like to describe the Coors boycott movement as a series of intersecting and overlapping boycotts. Begins in the 1950s and extends to the 1990s. So it's a very long boycott movement. In the 1950s and in the 1960s, activists really target Coors because of its employment practices at its flagship brewery in Golden, Colorado. There are a lot of problems or tensions between the labor unions at Coors and management. So the brewery workers themselves are unionized in a maintenance and production union. They do mostly kind of factory type work. It's not the kind of craft brewing we would think of today. They constantly are at odds with management over wages, over seniority, over workplace conditions. And so they go on strike on and off, and they have these sort of extended periods of tension with the company. And when they go on strike, they always call for a boycott, or they start to do that in the 1950s. And so that's where it begins for labor. The boycott becomes a tool through which they can place extra pressure on the company, because the company itself and the family, the Coors family, are pretty anti-union, and they'll go to really great lengths, and they'll go to great lengths to fight against the union. So the boycott begins in this context as a labor-based boycott. But around the same time in Colorado, there's another problem at the Coors brewery that doesn't have to do with unions, it has to do with who can get work at the brewery. The company is pretty notoriously discriminatory in its employment practices up until the mid-1960s, not hiring people of color. If they did hire people of color, they'd be tracked into janitorial positions or sort of lower skilled positions, if at all, if they could get past different hurdles for getting a job there. So Chicano activists, as well as African-American activists in Colorado, target the company and boycott the company for these employment-based discrimination issues. That's really where this begins. The boycott begins as something that's really focused at the physical brewery itself and the experience of work there. But as I found and as I detail in the book, the boycott extends well beyond the sphere of Colorado, as more and more people see Coors as sort of a symbol of anti-unionism, a symbol of discrimination, and then into the 1970s and 1980s, a symbol of far-right conservative politics because of the activities of the Coors family.
And their far-right politics has a longer history, as you write about and as you document in the book. I mean, this is a family saga, right? This is a company that has been very politically involved from the beginning with more conservative politics. Today we hear all about corporations and companies and where they're putting their money, and sometimes a corporation might be funding this politician versus that politician. Is Coors sort of on the vanguard of that? Are they leading a charge of more sort of corporate involvement in politics in the years after World War II? Or I mean, what can you tell us about their involvement there and what it means to sort of that kind of corporate involvement in American politics.
Yeah, absolutely. They're at the vanguard. I mean, I think historians of the conservative movement and historians of business have sort of pointed this out, but you know, the Coors family doesn't get the same amount of attention as some other big leaders. The first thing to say about the Coors family is, you know, they'd been in Colorado since the late 19th century. They founded this local brewery. The experience of Prohibition was really transformative for them in some ways. They became very opposed to state intervention, as one might expect, because the state basically made them shut down their production in the 1920s. But after Prohibition ends and then into the post-World War II period, the family is sort of silently involved in Colorado politics, really focused on promoting free market politics, also very invested in anti-communism. But it's not until the late 1960s that one family member in particular becomes much more public, and that's Joseph Coors. He's a third generation son or grandson, I guess, of the founder of the Coors Brewing Company. His first foray into politics is he sits on the Board of Regents at the University of Colorado. And when he does that, he is really pushing an anti-communist line. He's actually at odds with the Students for Democratic Society. He's at odds with UMAS on campus, United Mexican American Students. And then he kind of goes beyond Colorado in the 1970s and is paying for a lot of free market conservative organizations and causes in Washington, D.C., like the Heritage Foundation, other foundations that are less well known, the Committee for the Study of a Free Congress. He's behind the Reagan presidential campaigns and then administration. And so he is part of this new wave of businessmen who decide to be more and more involved in politics in order to push back against the expanding welfare state, basically. And he's doing this kind of surreptitiously with a lot of money, but then he's becoming more and more publicly involved. And that gives boycotters something to hold on to and makes them associate the beer with conservatism, basically.
Yeah. What was your experience as a researcher and as a historian writing about this family? Were you able to get into their collections or archives, like, or interview any family members, or what was that like?
So the Coors Brewery and Molson Coors now, because it's owned by a bigger conglomerate, their archives remain closed to the public, like many corporate archives. I did not interview any of the family members. In part, that was a choice by me because I wanted to tell the story of activists on the ground in the boycott. I feel that the company and the family have been able to dictate the narrative about this boycott for many years. But one of the great things about activists involved in this movement is they, you know, as you probably know from your book, you know, they save everything, every letter they get, every clipping, every legal document they're delivered. And so I would read the archive for the perspective of the family and the company as well. And in the sometimes nasty letters that they would send to activists, in the depositions when the company tried to sue activists, in lots and lots of news coverage of the company and the strikes and the boycotts. And so I was able to kind of understand their perspective. But of course, there's a lot about that family that remains sort of hidden from the public, and that's their choice. And that's sort of the way that they've been in terms of their relationship with the press and with activists and the public more generally.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, I mean, you talked about wanting to tell the story of the activists, and I think you do it very, very well in this book. And one of the things that I really appreciated is that a lot of times when we write about these politics, there's either a focus on radical politics or on conservative politics. And I feel like your book does both very well. Like, I feel like if I were teaching a seminar on conservative politics and post-war America, this would be a great book. If I was teaching a book on, or I was teaching a class on radical politics post-1960s, this would also be a great book. So you did that very well. Congratulations to you on doing that. That's not an easy thing to do. Tell us about these activists. Tell us about how you found them. How did you go about either talking to them? I know that there's also oral histories that you used, even from former collections. How did you first sort of dig into like where you were going to tell this story about the radical activists?
Mm-hmm. First, thank you. That was something that I really did not expect to have to do in this book, was to combine so many different fields.
Yeah.
I came into it thinking this would be like a straight up maybe Chicano and labor history, and you know, ended up diving into LGBT, queer historiography, conservatism, business, and beer also. So that was sort of a challenge. But in terms of finding activists, it was very difficult at first, but there were a couple of collections that really allowed me to kind of look into their organizing and figure out who was on the ground doing the organizing. The first collection I found was actually the Union Local 366. It's decertified in 1978. It's busted by Coors. And when that happened, somebody dropped off a couple boxes of their records at CU Boulder's archives, and they sat there for a couple decades.
Wow.
I don't know that I was the first person to look at them, but if I hadn't found them, I don't think the book would have ever happened, because Steve Kitty and I were like, I don't think there's going to be enough sources about this, and this helped. But one of the things that I appreciated about the Union was they kept a ledger book of every expense spent on the boycott. So they would keep track of every check sent to a boycotter across the West, because in the late 1970s, the Coors boycott mimicked the farm workers boycott, and that they sent workers to different cities. And so I was able to use that to figure out where activists were, and that I could follow them sort of through the archive to Los Angeles and look in archives there and figure out who they're talking to. And then, yeah, in a number of cases, I was able to locate people and interview them. A couple other sort of serendipitous finds for me was that a key person in this book is Freddie Trujillo, or Juan Trujillo, who grew up in Southern Colorado and then was really active in the boycott.
The nickname, or what did he go by?
Freddie Freak. Freddie. Yeah, and recently I was in Colorado and someone was like, oh yeah, I knew Freddie Freak. So he wore that name as a sort of badge of honor, but he ended up keeping collections of basically every movement he was involved in, and donated all of it to the University of Southern Colorado, which I think now is Colorado State Pueblo. So his entire personal archive is there. So I was able to find sort of these little bits of the story in archives across the country and pull things together. And it was not easy because, you know, one thing that we can say about boycotts is, in a way, they're kind of passive. I mean, certainly they take a lot of organizing on the ground, but if someone wants to express their commitment to a boycott, they don't do anything. There's no receipt, right?
Yeah.
They're out there marching, maybe they have a button. But sometimes I was worried that I wouldn't be able to follow the paper trail, and that there wouldn't be archival evidence. But there was in various places, and sometimes it was only one little folder in, you know, a Mecha chapter's archives somewhere. But it helped me figure out networks and follow people in that way.
Was there, so this is kind of a kind of historian nerd question here. Was there a point where you were like, I've got enough? I'm in, I can do this. This is no longer just going to be a seminar paper. This is now going to be a dissertation and then a book.
Yeah, so when I first started the project, I thought maybe the dissertation would be about Chicano consumer activism. It would do Coors boycott, farm workers boycott in more depth, and the FARA strike and boycott, and then maybe like Frito-Lay, because I thought there just wouldn't be that much material. I think the turning point for me was a summer I spent in Colorado, and I found the records in Pueblo, Freddie's records there, as well as extensive records at the Denver Public Library. And what I started to realize was that the Chicano boycott was just one chapter in this longer boycott. And it took me a long time to figure out the chronology, because sometimes there'd be kind of these overlapping moments where someone would show up in a different state, and I wasn't really sure how they connected. And eventually I did realize that what we were looking at was a multi-decade boycott movement. And I felt like I had to be able to tell the story in its entirety. Otherwise it wouldn't do justice to the work that activists did.
Yeah, well, you tell the story very, very well. Let's talk a little bit about the 1970s and the 1980s. The book, again, sort of stretches the timeline of radical politics. It's something that I've been very sort of invested in and concerned about in my own work, and I really appreciated the way you did it. But one of the things that you do that's different and distinct and new, I think, is write about the 1980s in a very sort of significant way. tell us about your thinking about sort of in the historiography, stretching radical politics and what it means when we often think that, or at least a lot of historians have sort of made the case that radical politics, you know, dims down into the 1970s, certainly COINTELPRO and other sort of surveillance initiatives that broke down our movements, and then internal bickering, whatever it might have been. But you seem to be saying there's something else going on here that we're not looking into. Say more about that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So when I was in graduate school, it was around the time that a couple of really influential books came out about coalition building and radical politics. Lauren Oreza's To March for Others about the farm workers and the Black Panthers, Gordon Mantler's Power to the Poor about the Poor People's Campaign, and then a little bit later is Max Krochmal's book, Blue Texas. And what I really appreciated about those three texts was they helped me figure out how to talk about this movement, because I was really confused at times in looking at the archival evidence as to how these different folks were coming together and what it meant. How did it mean? What did it mean for them to be in coalition? Because sometimes they were kind of fighting with each other. It wasn't really working. And so I appreciated the lenses that some of that newer historiography brought upon coalition building. However, most of those accounts end in the early 1970s. And so the Coors boycott allowed me to think about how coalition building is continuing into a period in which, yeah, you're right, historians have described the 70s and 80s as a period of declension. And I'll say, sort of from a personal scholarly perspective, a lot of my motivation in writing about the Coors boycott was after reading Jefferson Cowie's Staying Alive, where he basically says, you know, activism ends in the 70s. It's just, there's this incapacity of dissent. And I was looking at something that did not fit with that, that people were engaging in the boycott. They were doing creative organizing. Yeah, sometimes it wasn't successful, but it was still happening on the ground. And so I felt like this is a really good case study for understanding radical politics in the 1970s and 1980s, and the way in which activists use coalitions and kind of creative tools to keep going in their activism in spite of all of the challenges that they're facing. I'm not saying that there are not these extreme external and internal pressures on activists in this period, because to be sure there is. But I think that the thing that I really like about this particular story and this movement is that we see activists trying to keep their movements alive. And they're willing to take risks with each other. And sometimes there's a lot of inter-community fighting over the risks that they take, but they keep up with it. And they do so even into the 1980s. And so I think this movement, as well as others, help us to see kind of a longer arc of activism well after, you know, the long civil rights movement ends.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for, I think that's such an important point. I love that you do it. Can you tell us about that title? It's a wonderful title. How did you come up with that title? And tell us about the poster on the cover of the book.
Yeah, well, the title was came out of a text message chain with my editor, Brandon Proya at UNC Press, who, by the way, I loved working with him. Anybody who's interested in publishing with UNC Press should talk to him. Because originally the title I wanted to use, and it was the title for my dissertation, was a line from a protest song that said, "Giving up this beer for sweeter wine." And I love that title, but he was like, nobody's gonna know what you're talking about. So we were like, okay, it's gotta have brewing in it. So that ended up kind of just coming together organically, I guess.
In a text message chain back and forth? That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think we had like a bunch of ideas that were alliterative like that. So yeah, I'm happy about the title. And then the cover, it uses a poster, a broadside from the 1970s, from mid-1970s San Francisco. So there's this moment in the boycott where Teamsters, so kind of traditionally kind of conservative union members, white male conservative union members, actually come together with farm workers, with Black activists, with gay activists to build a boycott in San Francisco against Coors. And this was one of the broadsides that they used, which I think very visually demonstrated their vision of a coalition-backed boycott. And usually it came with, I think the image is in the book, a statement of like Coors is racist, Coors is anti-union, Coors is anti-people. The broadside would usually be bilingual. And so it was in the public domain, so we were able to use it for the cover.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. I love it. Tell us a little bit. I'm really fascinated in sort of movements that either haven't been written, people didn't know too much about them. The Coors boycott is one of those sort of movements that makes a bigger splash. That once you start to dig in, like you did, you start to realize, wait a minute, this is much bigger than just this one Chicano chapter that I want to write. This is saying something bigger. Tell us how this boycott remakes American consumer activism. What's the case you're trying to make here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's one of the key arguments of the book, and of course it's in the title, is that, the boycott or consumer activism has a really long history in the United States. I think that Chicano and Latino activists do a lot to kind of transform and revitalize it in the mid 20th century. But for a long time, the boycott was really something that was always attached to either a labor-based complaint or sort of a racial justice complaint, in which there was always just a single thing that boycotters wanted out of it. So social movement scholars sometimes call this like an instrumental boycott, where the boycott is a vessel for winning one key thing, or winning a key objective like a union, or winning a better contract. But over time, this boycott in particular becomes kind of detached from those workplace or racial justice concerns, and it doesn't become detached from them, but becomes bigger than them, and becomes more and more symbolic. It becomes a way for people in the 70s and 80s to communicate their own political and in some cases ethnic identities. I think this is a good example of this like continued activism in the 70s and 80s in spite of challenges, is that the boycott becomes a symbolic act of solidarity, of leftist politics, of anti-conservative politics. And one thing that I see happen with this movement in the 80s is that it becomes more and more focused on using a boycott on a company to make a political point. So it's not really about a demand on the company, but it's about a broader political demand. So the corporation becomes sort of a vector for political protest. I think that Coors boycotters set a new kind of standard of boycotts in which we think of our consumer dollars as being more and more linked to big political battles rather than simply being connected to a single corporation. Yeah. In part, this is a response to the fact that corporations in the 1970s and 1980s are more and more involved in politics. Yeah. And so activists are kind of responding and using that against corporations in a way. But I think it sets a model for the boycotts that we see today, which often focus more on the symbolic politics or the broader political affiliations of corporations than their actual product. So like, you don't boycott Chick-fil-A because you don't like chicken. You boycott Chick-fil-A because it signals and symbolizes a set of anti-gay conservative political beliefs.
Right. Yeah, you write about Chick-fil-A and some of the contemporary movements. I know that you've also done some public writing on brewing and breweries, right? And the kind of, I don't know, you might help me define this better, but the kind of cultures, white supremacist cultures maybe, around beer and craft beer brewing and so forth. Tell us a little bit about your work there and what writing about Coors taught you about how we can, how those spaces can be much more inclusive spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've actually, it's interesting, since the book came out, I've become more and more connected with like beer writers and beer Twitter and the craft beer world. And there's been a lot of interest in the book, which I didn't expect because I didn't think the book is that much about beer. I mean, it's about a beer, but like, it's not really about craft brewing or any of that. But as I've become more involved in that world, and as the craft brewing industry has faced like another wave of Me Too sort of reckonings, I think there's a lot of space to think about the ways in which the craft brewing industry, which makes itself seem very cool and hip and open and different from the big brewers like Coors or Anheuser-Busch, has basically replicated a lot of the white supremacist and patriarchal structures that were evident in big brewing of the late 20th century. It's still very much a white male space. There's a lot of issues in terms of access to work. When women or people of color do work in these spaces, they're often ostracized, or they feel like they don't really belong. And so something I've been thinking about with other folks who write about craft brewing is, how does a boycott like the Coors boycott offer a model of protest and change? Because the thing about the Coors boycott is that the company did change and become a better employer because of the pressure that it faced through a boycott. And so we've been having some conversations about whether or not that would work in the craft brewing age, where they're much smaller operations, they're not always unionized. But it's been a really interesting kind of crossover for me to be thinking about how this historical story can be of interest to people in an industry that seems different, but isn't all that different today.
Yeah, yeah. That's great to hear too, that this boycott changed the company in very positive ways. I know that it sort of surfaced on and off. The boycott did, of course. Is that something that's an ongoing thing today, or is this something that has faded out in the late 90s and early 2000s, or where does it stand now?
So I think it's sort of both around and not around, I don't know, because I always talk to people who still don't drink Coors.
Yeah.
In the same way that there are people who just don't eat grapes, right? Like, it was so entrenched in their upbringing and their activist identity. For a lot of people, it was entrenched in their Chicano or queer identity, and they don't drink it, they don't touch it. It still has those associations. From time to time, the company will do something that will kind of spark a new round of boycotts. Most recently, probably I think it was in the last 10 years, they came under a great deal of fire for sponsoring the Puerto Rican Day Parade. I think it was in 2013. I don't know, I can't really remember the year. And they put a slogan on their cans that was like, "Emboricuate." And everyone was pretty upset about that kind of co-optation. But there hasn't really been a similar sustained coalition-backed movement in the way that we would have seen up until like the early 2000s.
Wow, okay, okay. We have been talking to Allyson P. Brantley, who wrote Brewing a Boycott, How a Grassroots Coalition Fought Coors and Remade American Consumer Activism. Professor Brantley, thank you so much for talking to Latinx Talk. Those of you out there, you see the book, go out and get yourselves a copy. It's fantastic. I think it just really speaks to, again, writing about radical and conservative politics. Also, I think the evolution of Chicano history and the way we think about it and the way we write about it, and how sources and the research that we do can really sort of expand, one area of Chicano history that's been so significant. Because like you say, the people that don't eat grapes and don't drink Coors beer, like that's just, the way that it goes. And so to be able to think about the significance of this boycott, not just in Colorado, not just in the Southwest, but, across the country as well. Professor Brantley, thank you so much for talking with us today, and congratulations on writing a fantastic book.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. That was great.